But I'm going to turn over and let Christian Diaz, who is a former LSNA youth coordinator, but is currently working for Chuy Garcia, trying to get him elected as our new mayor. But he is going to take the lead for tonight. Come on up here, Christian.
Cool. I'm actually not going to use the mic, if that's okay, because I feel like I'll let it. So as Amy says, my name is Christian Diaz. I once worked at Logan Square Neighborhood Association. I don't anymore because I'm so excited about changing the direction of our city and electing a new mayor. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics in the whole world, racism. Yep, I think anybody who knows me will say this about Christian Diaz. He won't shut up about racism. And I don't really plan to. And honestly, I can't, right? Because this is an experience that as a person of color, I have to deal with and live with every single day. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. Even though the title of my presentation deals with racism and its relation to the foreclosure crisis that led to the economic downturn in 2008, I am actually really just going to speak from my own personal experience and sort of really try to illuminate what it's been like to see this neighborhood transformed and changed in the last couple of years. It's really accelerated quite unexpectedly. And as somebody who grew up here, and as somebody who is very much tied into the community here of Spanish-speaking immigrants, it's been a very interesting ride so far. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So up here, this is where my story begins. I was born in Mexico, which shares the southern border with the United States. And what we're talking about tonight really is moving, right? And place and the idea of home. And this is where I was born, but not where I grew up. And to be a little more specific, we can move on to the next slide. I was born in the state of Jalisco, in a small city called Tepatitlán de Morelos, which is about 40 minutes northeast of Guadalajara, which is the second largest city in Mexico. And something that I would like to share about my hometown is that one, Tepatitlán, or Tepa for short, is known for having the most beautiful women in Mexico, and I think my mom would agree with that. Two, we are the largest egg producers in the country, so that's interesting. Also, that state is where tequila was born. So, yeah. And also where mariachi music was invented. So that's where I'm from, that's where I was born, but that's not really my home. We can move on to the next slide. My home is here in Chicago, in Logan Square, Avondale, Hermosa, I don't know. This is where I grew up, and here you can see me as an adorable child with my siblings, and actually, I don't know who that kid is. But yeah, even though I wasn't born here, this is where my home is. And we can move on to the next slide. Things I remember about growing up in Logan Square, I remember trick-or-treating, going down Milwaukee Avenue into McDonald's, into the Sunflower Market. Café con leche. Those are some of the memories I have. I also remember, when the Logan Square theater smelled like piss, right? When the popcorn cost like $2. When, my mom took me to see The Emperor's New Groove there. We only paid $3 to get in, and we missed the first 20 minutes of the movie, and we stayed around and watched the movie again a second time because my mom loved it so much, and I loved it. It's a great movie. I also remember watching Pocahontas there. I remember I went to Monroe Elementary School, which is on Wrightwood and Monticello. And I remember every day after school, I would ask my mom for a couple of quarters. I'd head over to Ziggy's. Maybe I'd get some fries. I'd play the arcade games in the back. I was really good at Mortal Kombat. So those are some things I remember. And have a deep connection to this place. This is my home. I love it here. I went away for 5 years for college to California, spent some time in North Carolina, and when I came back, after 5 years of being gone, this place was very different from what I remember. I really spent my early 20s outside of Chicago, so when I came back, I was really excited. There was all these like hip bars and like coffee shops and new restaurants and things for me to do, which I appreciated. But while I was away in school, part of my learning was really thinking about how to articulate these strange feelings that I've had my whole life in regard to the color of my skin and my relation to people with, a different color. And, my critical analysis was at a different place where I could really ask myself some deeper questions about what's been happening in Logan Square during the last couple of years. We can move on to the next slide. And, one of the things that was really important for me in college was asking why. Why did my mother decide to move to Chicago instead of raising me where she was raised, where her parents were raised and their parents were raised? And in thinking about that question, I really thought about two different lenses, right? And the first one was, move on to the next slide. The personal. That's a picture of my mom and my dad. But one of the reasons my mom decided to move to Chicago, well, actually the reason, was that she was a pregnant teenager. She got pregnant when she was like 15 or 16 or 17 or something, I'm not quite sure. And as a very young mom in a small town, a small city in Mexico, it's frowned upon to get pregnant out of wedlock. And her dad, my grandfather, who I actually never met, decided that, that was very shameful for her family, for their family. And so they actually kicked my mom out of the house, right? She got kicked out and she didn't know what to do. My biological father married some other girl. And so my mom decided, you know what? This isn't really the best place for me to raise a child on my own. So I'm gonna, travel north and seek opportunities elsewhere. And really, it's a very common narrative, right? People come to the United States in search of the American dream, of making it big and being able to provide their children with the things that they couldn't enjoy themselves during their upbringing. So that was, that's the kind of individualistic, micro explanation about why my mom brought me here as a child. But then we can also look at it from a larger point of view, a wider point of view. And, that would be the structural dynamics that led my mom to leave Mexico because, why couldn't she raise a child on her own in Mexico? Well, there are systems that interact with each other in a way that make it difficult for people to make a living in Mexico. And oftentimes, people in Mexico are forced to either move to a city or move to the north, right, to the United States in search of a living wage. And that was definitely true for my mother. If you think about the systems or the structures that led my mom to move, you can think about NAFTA in 1994, where all of a sudden the Mexican economy opened to subsidize corn. And all of a sudden people who were able to feed themselves and clothe themselves by growing corn and selling it in markets could no longer compete with the heavily subsidized agricultural business that was flooding the Mexican market. And so there's a personal, a micro level reason for why we moved to Chicago, but there's also the larger structural reason as to why my mother brought me here. And we can use those same lenses to think about what is causing displacement in Logan Square. And that is how I'm going to tie race into this conversation. Move on, I do want to cover some really basic topics or themes regarding race. And none of this is originally thought up by me, but it really is a synthesis of years of really different things. But I'm not going to credit anybody. So there are two types of racism. There's internal racism and there's external racism. When we think about internal racism, we're talking about bias, right? Most of us operate from a place of subconscious thought, and we don't have much control over how our subconscious is developed. But it does inform the way that we interact with the world. And as you all know, at least as I know as somebody who went to school in Logan Square, our schools are very segregated. So, as a person of color, I never really interacted much with black people or white people as a child, and really my subconscious developed ideas about other races that inform the way I interact with others, based out of things like television and media. We can also talk about privilege. When we're born into a system, right, into a society that has already in many ways set parameters for how a person can interact with the world based on the color of their skin. And some people have more privilege than others. I have more privilege than a black person, right, unfortunately. And white people have more privilege than me, so there is a spectrum of privilege that we can talk about. And then internalized racism. This is something that I experience when I'm talking to my younger sister who's 15 years old, who says things like, Christian, she's a light-skinned Mexican. So she says things like, Christian, I'm white. Or sometimes she'll say, Christian, you're like a white Mexican because of the way you speak. And I have to challenge her to think, well, why do you associate my vocabulary or me being articulate with whiteness? That's something that we need to, that I want to help her to dissect and explore. So that's the internal, those are the internal, forms of racism. Then there's the external, right? Me being afraid of walking around at night in a black neighborhood. That's an example of interpersonal racism. Or if I say something really horrible, to somebody who's Mexican but has a darker skin tone than me, then that's a form of interpersonal racism. That's when we're talking about slurs and that kind of thing. Institutional racism refers to how systems, right, like the systems that set the parameters for our lives, interact with each other to benefit one race over another. And we're talking about the healthcare system, the education system, housing. That's an example of institutional. Structural is a lot harder to explain, but really this building is a good metaphor for structural racism. This building is holding us up, right? It's keeping us warm, it's keeping us safe, it's protecting us from the outside world, and at the same time we can't see the foundation of it. So that's a metaphor for structural racism. It's hard to see, but really our entire lives and our entire experiences are founded in these. I won't go into this slide, but I'm sure you remember that. But before I go further, I do want to talk a little bit more about the work I was doing when I was at Logan Square Neighborhood Association. I was there for 2 years as a youth education organizer, and I had the distinct privilege of building relationships with young people in Logan Square, in Hermosa, in Avondale. And here's a photo of us when we threw a culture bomb at the monument, the Eagle Monument, as a way to reclaim public space culturally for us. Because in my conversations with these young people, they often said, I used to love going to the Eagle and hanging out there, but now I don't feel welcome in that space. And so I wanted to create that space for them, again, to engage with that landscape. And apart from building relationships with these young people through my job at Logan Square Neighborhood Association, I really enjoyed helping these youth think through the micro and macro level of oppression that they experience and helping them develop the language to talk about these experiences. And here we went, I don't remember where, we went somewhere to protest with the but it was a lot of fun doing this. And through my relationships with these young people, most of them attend a high school that is about a mile or less down Redwood, Calvin Park High School, very close to us, walking distance from me. And I was really struck by the stories I kept hearing from the students. You know, stories about parents getting deported. I can think about a student who had to stop going to school for 6 months and then got kicked out of that school. And the reason he couldn't go to school was that he had to stay home and look after his nephews because, you know, his sister was a single mother who had to feed her kids. And more, as we sat in circles and we really practiced restorative justice and those values, I learned even more about these young people and the things they have to go through living in this neighborhood and in this country. One of them specifically, Katy Peñarosa, was a beautiful soul. She was a leader with Logan Square Neighborhood Association ever since she was a middle school student at Ames Middle School, which recently, unfortunately, converted into a military academy, despite the wishes of the leaders. And she was somebody who is braver than me, I think, because she had the ability to stand up in front of hundreds, thousands of people and speak from the heart and move people to change their minds and to think critically about oppression in our lives. And I really respected her and bonded with her. And I miss her a lot because unfortunately, about 2 years ago, her father was caught driving without a license, and that set off a process that eventually led to his deportation. After that happened, her mother had a really hard time paying for rent. And they decided that it would be better for them to move back to Mexico where the father was, so that way they could be together. And I'm sure that if Katy was still in Chicago and Logan Square, she'd be standing here with me, sharing some of these stories. And so, there's a picture of her with Luther. So the reason I'm sharing these stories is because these are the stories that I carry with me everywhere I go. Everywhere I go in Logan Square. And it definitely informs the way that I feel about the changes that have been taking place in this neighborhood. It definitely influences sometimes really bitter responses to the changes that are taking place in this neighborhood. Because oftentimes, what I'm experiencing is this confrontation with privilege that really, I wouldn't say reinforced, but just reminds me in kind of a traumatic way how incredibly unequal our society is. When I think about these youth at Calvin Park High School, where there have been severe budget cuts. I think last year there was a budget cut of about $4 million to the school. While this is happening, I also hear about how Ray Colon has given $200,000 in TIF money to Revolution Brewing. Meanwhile, the bathroom, and that was to renovate the bathrooms at Revolution Brewing. With no, not to badmouth that business, they're doing what they can to stay afloat, and I go there sometimes. But that's just an example, right, of the things that I have to think about or confront as I walk around the new Logan Square. Recently, Lula Cafe, which I also frequent and I love and have a great staff. I'm not discouraging anybody from going there. Recently, they announced that for Halloween, they were going to dress up as a quinceañera to celebrate Halloween and to celebrate their 15th anniversary. Which, it's a clever idea, but to me and to the students of Calvin Park who live this reality, you know, for Lula Cafe, sure, it's fun to pretend to be Mexican for a couple, you know, for a night, right? For a night of fun. I wish I could pretend to be Mexican just for a night and not have to deal with the everyday reality of 10,000 Latinos being evicted or forced to relocate from Logan Square, or the reality that, you know, my people in my family are at risk of getting deported. So, to me, that is how I experience racism in this context of gentrification. That's just one way, but really that's more interpersonal or more internal. If you, another example, when I hear about my high school students who are often, you know, kind of checked by the police when they're at this park or they're at the monument, you know, they're often checked at that park and sort of feel like they can't be there because they might be harassed by police. At the same time, I see young white people there all the time drinking publicly, and the police never say anything to them. So again, it's an example of how I'm constantly reminded that we live in a very unequal society. And yeah, it angers me. You know, another example is the Logan Square Theater. As I said, you know, budget cuts to public institutions like schools and parks and libraries. And meanwhile, Ray Colon was able to find $1 million to give to Mark Fishman to renovate the Logan Theater. And after it was renovated, I went there one night with my cousins because we wanted to watch a horror movie. And as I was walking in, I saw the supervisor or whatever, manager standing outside. As I was walking up to the kiosk to purchase some tickets, he ran inside to tell the lady working the counter not to sell me tickets unless my cousins who I was with were accompanied by their parents. And I thought to myself, since when do movie theaters check for, you know, birth certificates? Any other theater I go to with younger people, I can enter without question because I'm older, you know, I'm old enough for them and as long as I'm accompanying them. And yet I wasn't allowed to do that at the Logan on this night. And I wonder if I were white or my cousins were white, and we have to face the same scrutiny. So these are some examples of the way that I experience racism in Logan Square as it gentrifies. And really, I guess my main point is that gentrification oftentimes triggers trauma, because while I have to live the reality of being a person of color in this community, I also get to see, you know, white people going to the slippery slope or to the cool bars, having the time of their lives, without just the difference in our experience is alarming to me. And oftentimes the obliviousness that I see in the young white people that encounter in Logan Square is also offensive. And really, as I said, being a person of color in a racist society is very stressful, and gentrification forces us to witness intimately the stark racial inequality of the city and this country. I think that's something I saw before. So we move on to the next slide. But I don't want to just come here and badmouth white people and make you guys all feel bad about yourselves. You know, I want to give you some tips, right, about how to approach these sorts of conversations, how to think about racism in the context of gentrification in Logan Square. And so therefore, I have prepared, and I stole this from a thinker, Lonnie Ayo, who's really awesome, you guys should Google her. But she wrote a book called I Can Fix Racism and So Can You. And these are 5 really easy steps to starting that process of healing. 1, admit it, racism is real. Why do I have to keep telling people that racism is a thing? 2, listen. If a person of color says that they've experienced racism in any way, don't try to discredit them, don't get defensive. Just listen to what they have to say and take it at face value, because you know what? A person of color knows a little bit more about racism than a white person can. 3, educate yourself. You know, really, you know, read a book. 4, broaden your experience. Make friends with people who are not white, and don't ask them to explain their race to you. And don't ask them to explain why members of a particular race behave a certain way. we're expecting to explain how, everybody in that race feels about a certain topic. Okay? And finally, and this is really why I'm so happy that you guys are here, is take action. Because today I talked about two lenses through which we can think about racism and gentrification, and the one is through that micro level of individual experiences. Right? But two, there's that macro level, that system level of inequality that we live in, where some schools are funded more than others because of the population that attends those schools, where some people have access to more resources from the government to be able to purchase a home or to get a loan to purchase a home than other people do. And oftentimes that is based on the difference of the color of people's skin. And really, it's really hard to change our racist society when we're thinking about individual interactions. But when we look at the systemic level of inequality that really gives white people a lot more privileges than people of color, that is where together as a group we can really make an impact if we're changing policies. And that's why it's so important that you all are here and that we all work together to get Jesus Chuy Garcia elected. But that's why it's important that we're all here. And I was going to say something really relevant and beautiful, but I forgot what it was. So instead, I'll just say thank you for listening to me and have a great night.